This is your PowerPoint for the PowerPoint quiz on the causes of the Civil War. The Second Great Awakening. Settlers had begun moving into the Western territories and begun participating in religious revivals. Their main leader was a man named Charles Finney, who preached a revival of the Puritan beliefs. But this time, Puritan beliefs were connected to more of a social criticism of institutional sins in the United States, not a reform of Great Britain from afar. The two major institutional sins were slavery and the greed of northeastern industrialization. Reform movements. The Second Great Awakening led to multiple reform movements. For example, Dorothea Dix wanted to provide for insane asylums that would rehabilitate the insane. There was the temperance movement, which attempted to moderate the use of alcohol in the cities for family and economic stability. And Horace Mann advocated for the creation of local public schools in the states to create virtuous Protestant citizens. Abolitionism. Probably the most important reform movement of this time period was the abolitionist one. The abolitionists tried to get rid of slavery, but they themselves were broken into different groups. In fact, there were three groups that formed to oppose slavery. The gradualists supported the gradual removal of slavery by isolating it to the South and letting it die over time on its own. Immediatists were more radical for their time period. They advocated for an immediate removal of slavery because it violated God's higher law. The leader was William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison wrote a pamphlet called The Liberator in Massachusetts. He argued that man's law was different from God's higher law. Man's law created laws like promoting slavery. God's higher law was based upon justice and could be used to criticize man's law. Then there was the third group, the American Colonization Society, which advocated for blacks to leave America and colonize Liberia in Africa. Some believed that this was the best way for black people to gain protection, but there were others who had racist motivations and saw this as a way to get rid of the so-called black problem in America. Suffragism. Suffragists argued that black liberation was interconnected to women's freedom. They argued that any form of prejudice, whether based upon sex or race, would just reinforce one another and exacerbate the problems. Women met at Seneca Falls and formed a Declaration of Independence that was pretty much the same as the Declaration of Independence signed in 1776, except this one argued that women had to be freed from multiple different forms of oppression. Voting was only one. They also called for property rights for women, divorce rights, and for higher education. Transcendentalism. There was a literary movement that was led by Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. The Transcendentalists criticized urban life as society's use of rationality to imprison the individual for the purpose of efficiency and production. The solution then was to escape out to nature and connect with the spirit, or what Transcendentalists called the oversoul, that connects all people and nature. Transcendentalists criticized slavery, American expansion, and urbanization as different forms of conformity. Radical communities. A few reform groups took the basic principles and expanded them to the idea of creating human perfectionism. For example, the Shakers were a religious group that believed that they wanted to create a communal society based upon sharing wealth. The Brooks Farm was a secular communal society that tried to share everything, including wealth and sexual partners. Political party development. During this time period, a number of political parties began to form. The Democratic Republicans split during the Jacksonian Age. The Northeastern members broke away and formed the Whig Party. The Whigs believed in a strong centralized government, tariffs, and industrialization. Notice that this harkens back to the tradition of the Federalists. There were Whigs in both the northern and southern states. This was able to stave off extreme sectionalism that would eventually lead up to the Civil War. Full-blown sectionalism was not yet a problem of the political parties and wouldn't become a problem until about 1856. Origins of slavery. Slavery began as a replacement labor for indentured servants. The British, French, and Spanish traders brought African slaves from Western Africa, primarily to the Caribbean and to South America. The trade included Western Africa, Caribbean, and then back to Europe. This was called the Triangle Trade. The passage leading from Africa over to North America was known as the Middle Passage, and today has become extremely infamous because during that Middle Passage, so many African Americans died from disease and from maltreatment aboard the ships that carried them over to the Caribbean. North American slavery. The growth of slavery was largely due to natural reproduction. The major states that held slaves were Virginia and South Carolina. Most Southerners could not afford to own slaves, but most Southerners used black people as an instrument to justify their lowered status in the Southern hierarchy. Historians today believe that slavery would have died through isolation and competition with the North. But Eli Whitney's cotton gin that was created in the 1820s led to an expansion of slavery. The cotton gin allowed for the seeds of cotton to be separated from the plant through mechanization, and this meant that there was a greater need for more cotton production in the fields, leading to the need for more slaves. Manifest Destiny and the North American continent. Andrew Jackson brought Florida into the Union away from the Spanish. U.S. farmers in Maine fought Canadians on the boundaries of Maine, ending in the final northeastern boundaries on the east coast. Britain then agreed to hand over Oregon to the U.S., leading to the northwest boundary. At that point, the only thing left over was the southwest. So, the Americans attempted to get this during the Mexican-American War, which would eventually bring the Southwest under the American control, away from Mexican control. The major fight during all of these issues was over the balance in the Senate over new representation. The Senate becomes extremely important. Whoever controls the Senate would either be able to place limits or destroy slavery, or on the other hand, allow for slavery to grow or at least be protected. Kansas, Nebraska. President Pierce wanted a transcontinental railroad, so he had the government do what was called the Gadsden Purchase. This is where the government bought land from Mexico in order to create a railroad. The North saw this as a Southern conspiracy. This would allow the South to transport goods and slaves across the country. So one of the Northern senators, Senator Stephen Douglas from Illinois, proposed a transcontinental railroad for the North. However, to create this in the place that he wanted to have, it would require the organization of the Nebraska Territory. And there was a fear that by allowing Nebraska in, it would unbalance the representation in the Senate. So a compromise was reached to split Nebraska into two. One, with Nebraska up in the north as free, and two, with the southern section becoming slave, known as Kansas. The problem was that both abolitionists and pro-slave groups saw Kansas as a symbolic issue and sort of the heartland of America. So they began emigrating to Kansas to sway the vote. The vote was taken on something called the Lecompton Constitution. But within this constitution, slave owners had created what was called the Tricky Clause. This tricky clause would ensure that slaves that were already there would be allowed to remain in the state no matter what. When people found out about this, it led to a bloody civil war in Kansas and an inability to decide on the future of Kansas as a free or slave state. The Dred Scott case. Dred Scott was a slave for the military physician John Emerson. Emerson traveled to free areas in the Wisconsin Territory and Illinois. This raised a question. When Scott went to these free territories, did he become free? Abolitionists took this case all the way to the Supreme Court. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time was a man named Roger Taney. Taney made the following decision. Black slaves are not citizens, and therefore the case shouldn't be heard in front of the Supreme Court anyways. Now, if he had stopped there really wouldn't have been any problem legally at the time for the United States. But Taney wanted to go down in history, so he decided to go one step further and solve the problem of slavery once and for all. So, he made the argument that Congress does not have the right to regulate slavery at all, since slaves are private property. This had a serious impact. It meant that all previous compromises had been nullified by his decision. This included the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850. This all led up to one of the most important symbolic events in American history leading up to the Civil War, known as Sumner v. Brooks. Charles Sumner was an abolitionist senator from Massachusetts. He was also strongly religious. At one point, he got up in front of the Senate and ridiculed South Carolina and the South for the evils of slavery. He then personally attacked, on a rhetorical level, Andrew Butler. Butler's nephew, Preston Brooks, physically attacked Sumner in the Senate with a cane, causing Sumner to suffer a coma. Massachusetts went ahead after this and re-elected Sumner, even though he was in a coma. The South, however, sent Brooks a collection of new canes in the mail. The point was that the South and the North were now almost completely separated into two different regions, the North viewing the South as evil slave owners, and the South viewing the North as self-righteous individuals who just looked down on the South. Civil War compromises. The Missouri Compromise, or Compromise of 1820, was meant to be the first step in solving some of the problems that were happening in the Senate. In 1819, Missouri wanted to enter the Union, upsetting the balance in the Senate. There was an exact equal number of states in the North and in the South. Missouri entering in would upset this balance. Senator James Talmadge offered an amendment to eliminate slavery altogether in Missouri. This was rejected. Henry Clay then offered a compromise to make Maine free and Missouri a slave state. Up until now, Maine had been a part of Massachusetts. They carved Maine out of Massachusetts, made that free, and then made Missouri a slave state to maintain the balance. Clay then provided for a long-term solution based upon the 3630 parallel. The idea was to take this line at the 3630, draw it out across North America, and then that would become a dividing line in which everything below would be slave and everything above would be free.